Okay, good evening. Welcome to the most recent edition of Building the Scottish State with myself, Dr. Mark McNaught. And I have the great pleasure of having with me this evening Mrs. Amanda Burgauer. I think I got it right. You live in the Southern Uplands of Scotland and are very passionate about rural affairs. Also, you are on the NEC and of the S1.EP8. And also head of the, very involved with the Common Weal. So first of all, Amanda, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
I'm delighted to be here, Mark. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. So first of all, just give us a little bio. You can embellish it as much as you want. There's no problem. But, how did you, where are you from? How did you get involved in politics? What drives you, and what gives what is the source of this profound interest in youth equality and rural affairs?
Sure. So it's a long story because I'm quite old. But so I grew up in Ayrshire, although people never believe that because of the accent. And during Maggie Thatcher's era, there really weren't very many opportunities for young people. And I ended up moving abroad and living in Canada and the States for 15 years. And I actually was quite engaged with politics there as well. But when I came back to Scotland, it was a time of real optimism. I came back just before the millennium and was really excited, and there seemed to be a vibrancy.
Yeah, and that's just after the Scottish Parliament had been created as well.
Yeah. So there was this real feeling of things are moving, and that was great. I spent the next 10 years or so really trying to make a living, but also being involved in local activities, and especially pre-referendum, I was chairing a lot of town hall meetings and things like that during the referendum, build up to the referendum. And I sort of stayed engaged with it on that. I've always cared passionately about rural issues because I've always lived rurally, apart from, sojourns in big cities. But once you've been rural, it tends to stick with you. And I'm living rurally now in the Southern Uplands. Well, I'm living the very bottom tip of South Lanarkshire for the people that that know our area.
How far from that is it to the English border from there, roughly?
It's about 65 miles, something like that. Okay. So when I actually stood as a candidate for Westminster in 2017, sorry. Can't remember. But at the last general election, I stood in a constituency that reaches from the border, from Gretna up to Annan, and goes almost all the way to Glasgow. From east to west, it's really broad. And that really brought home to me the fact that people living in different areas have got quite different concerns. So when you talk to people in the Central Belt about putting a border up in the south of Scotland, they might have one opinion, but actually the people who cross that border every day also feel very strongly about it and maybe have different concerns. And of course, we've got a border with Northern Ireland in Stranraer that is much neglected. We don't talk about it very much. I've been a member of the S1.EP8 since around the referendum. Okay. I've been on the national executive of the S1.EP8 as the member-elected regional rep for the south of Scotland.
Right. Yeah.
I've been on that for about a year. So that's quite interesting. And I joined Common Weal in February of this year. I've been a long-time supporter of Common Weal, and I've volunteered with them in the past. But this February, I was appointed by the Common Weal board as Interim Director to go in and do some organizational change, bring their systems up to scratch, and all that kind of thing.
Okay. All right. And is Robin McAlpine still, is Robin McAlpine still involved? Is he?
Robin McAlpine is my good friend and is still very much involved. Good. He's stepped into a role which is more head of strategy, and it's giving him more time to write and also to do his own stuff. So yeah, a little secret there. Keep your eyes open. Something exciting might be happening soon. But yeah, Robin and I talk every day, just about.
Okay. All right. So tell us a little bit more about your interest in youth equalities and rural issues. What are you said just a couple of minutes ago that, if you talk to someone in Glasgow, obviously there's a big the issues are very different of what they of what their concerns are. What are some of these differences? What are some of the concerns that rural people would have that people in the Central Belt wouldn't?
So I'm going to separate the rural from the youth, although there is a crossover, but I'll talk about them separately. So if you live in the Central Belt and you think of rural, you tend to think of farmers who own a lot of land and have a lot of money. But when you live rurally, you know that the farmer next door is probably a tenant farmer who struggles to make a living. The average wage of tenant farmers and of people who work in agriculture is incredibly low. And quite frankly, it's below minimum wage for some of these people who are renting but running their own farms. I think it probably takes a certain amount of rural experience to understand that. And I also think that we tend to say, the farmers, they're the ones that got us into this mess. But actually,
referring to Brexit.
To Brexit, to the Conservative vote, the south of Scotland, a bit south of where I am, is predominantly a blue belt across the bottom. And there are reasons for that. And it is about a way of life and a resistance to change. But there are also some core values that I don't think we understand very well, or we don't talk about them very much.
Well, if you can explain them, that would be great. So what are these? And I get that, to a certain extent. And, you always think, well, how could they vote for Tories, but, given the economic component of it, but there's usually, just like with American conservatives, there's very cultural reasons as well. So maybe you could help explain that.
Very much so. And, rural people tend to be small c conservative in lots of ways. And then you've got weird people like me. But it's about communities in rural areas tend to be looking after each other very well. And we've seen that throughout the pandemic. The rural villages and small towns have really worked together and volunteered to look after their neighbours and all of that kind of thing. And there's a very strong bond in rural areas with that. There's also a lot of concern about the way that landowners are perceived. And we've got, there are issues that Common Weal supports Revive, and we want to ban a lot of shooting and things like that. But for people who live in rural areas, they've sort of grown up making a bit of pocket money as a beater. And there's a different attitude to some of these things where there isn't really a dialogue between the two sides. And that's something that I'm always quite keen on.
The two sides, you mean people in the Central Belt that just don't understand?
I don't want to be anti-Central Belt. I've got friends up there, but it's a cultural thing.
Just a lack of understanding. I'm not saying that there's a conflict there, but just a lack of understanding on the part of people.
Well, I think it's a cultural thing. If you grow up in rural, you tend to have had very different experience growing up. So I'm also the trustee of a children's charity, Winston Lodge, which is rural. And it's one of my great joys to watch the young people that we work with who live surrounded by concrete all their lives and get to come down and run around in 53 acres of glorious woodland and activity area. And, that growing up experience is very different.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And absolutely. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm just saying ideally we would all have the chance to experience both.
Okay. Is there a religious component to that conservatism?
Not in my experience. I think that's where it's quite different from the States. I think that rural people are just as irreligious as people in the Central Belt. I know my local congregation is quite small. I mean, within my local area, there used to be, even 15 years ago, there were probably 10 local parishes, and they're basically now all been merged together. And that's about church-going practice. Okay. It's dropped dramatically, which you wouldn't see in the States.
Okay. All right. And so if you were to, maybe enumerate 4 or 5 important issues for rural life and youth equality, what would they be? What are the things that need to be resolved?
A lot of it revolves around infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Rural infrastructure is incredibly poor compared with areas with more population and more votes. They've got bigger voices. Where you've got less dense population, sparse population, it's really hard to lobby. You don't have the same lobbying power. And so infrastructure is really bad. Our broadband actually is beginning to get better in the south of Scotland, although that's not true across all rural Scotland. Mm-hmm. But I would say that, broadband infrastructure, which is where Scottish government has actually been very busy and very focused, that's working well. Mm-hmm. But our roads and rail infrastructure is really poor. I can look out of my rural house and see the railway, but I have to drive 40 minutes before I can get on a train. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's because of Beeching in the 70s, who shut down all these local stations.
Okay. So back in the 60s, there would have been a much more local station that you could have.
Yeah, there would have been one about, 500 yards from my house.
Okay, and is that the Borders Railway that was recently reopened?
No, so I'm on the west side, and the Borders Railway is on the east side.
Okay.
The Borders Railway has been a massive success, though, in terms of the number of people using it. I mean, how do you measure?
And it basically goes from Edinburgh to Carlisle, is that right?
No, it currently goes from Edinburgh to Galashiels. Okay. And the hope is that Galashiels will then link up with Carlisle. But that will be going east-west, whereas the bit from Edinburgh to Gala is going north-south. Mm-hmm. But hopefully, that continuation will happen. And that's one of the problems. If you live in the south of Scotland, you've got no good roads going from Stranraer to Eyemouth, for example. Those are places in the east and the west coast, but right in the south. You can't go across. Mm-hmm. And I noticed Johnny's talking about the Duke of Buccleuch has a lot.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that, just to the whole. And now, are all of these tenant farmers on what you could call aristocratic land? I mean, is it exclusively that, or are there more kind of entrepreneurial private landowners as well that aren't necessarily dukes or whatever? Tell me a little bit about that system.
I think most of the tenant farmers, and I'm sure that they're going to let us know if I'm saying this wrong, certainly most of the tenant farmers I know lease their farms from one of the big estates. We have a couple of the big estates around here.
Okay, and is that kind of like a sharecropping system that exists? Well, exists in a lot of places, but where the farmer farms, and then does he have to give a share of the crop to sell through the landowner, or is it just he sells everything, but he has to pay the
commercial transaction where they, and different leases, different tenant farmers will have different arrangements because that's all about their lease. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I know Andy Whiteman has done a lot of work on this, and the land reform. And from what I understand, I don't know a lot about the details, but there's been some efforts to make land reform in the Scottish Parliament, but it's very difficult, obviously, and it's easy to understand why, given the wealth and the power and the fact that. But what do you think in independent Scotland, how things could be different? Because, for example, I understand that there you have the land registry. There's only like 28% of the land that's like officially registered. You can see where it is. You also have the registry of Saisine, where it's these weird things that like describe what the borders of the things are. You go from that tree to that rock to that hill or something like that, but there's not real, but it's not, like computer thing where you can see exactly who owns it, where it is. I mean, that would seem to be one of the things that could be reformed, where you have a much clearer, who owns what and who could be subject to taxation, et cetera. Whereas as it is with this registry of Sazine, it just seems completely opaque.
It is. There's great progress being made by government agencies to try and get that up to date.
Yeah.
But there has historically been a massive lack of transparency. And part of that is because the landowners don't necessarily hold that ownership in Scotland.
Right.
So they're likely to.
I know there's a lot of sheiks and
islands or wherever. So it's very difficult to see what they actually own. Mm-hmm. Land reform is absolutely vital for a sustainable Scotland. I feel very strongly about it. And there is stuff that we could be doing now, mm-hmm. Which I'm going to say a lot tonight. There is stuff we could be doing now, but we're not doing it. Mm-hmm. And I would like to see a lot more progress in this Parliament working on land reform and other rural issues.
Okay. And what do you, and given that, well, they haven't made much progress, up till now. And there's probably good reasons for that of, lobbying by the Duke of Buccleuch and others. But I mean, if you were to say, okay, how would you want to design a constitution or law that, where you could, work on it independently, and then, once independence is achieved, that these proposals can be, ready to go for, what are some of the main reforms that you would like to be able to make?
I'd like to see a system where we have a much more equal method of appointing people to basically patronage. Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about the Duke of Buccleuch, we've got Benny Higgins, who works for the Duke of Buccleuch, is also on all of these Scottish government bodies.
I heard about that. I understood that. Yeah.
And so, we need to look at who's actually advising government and who's lobbying government. And that's the kind of stuff that we could be, whether the will, we could be looking at that right now. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important that we do. But, if we want to prepare for an independent Scotland, we need to do the work on the Constitution. We need to do the work on currency. If we want to win an independence referendum, we have to have the answers to the questions that people asked last time, and we didn't have a convincing argument.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I started writing back in 2012. I started writing for Newsnet Scotland about the need for a constitution, and the first article I was written, let's develop a prototype. Let's put it out there and say, if you vote for this, this is what you're getting, because I felt that there was too much reluctance to not want to rock the boat. Oh, do we have the monarchy? Oh, no, don't talk about that. And same with currency. Oh, we can't talk about that. We'll keep. You know how I went. But do you feel that? But I've always felt that it's necessary to say, okay, because I remember my uncle. He was like, well, I'll examine how much is it going to cost me, kind of thing, and they didn't have the answers. And I interviewed Kenny McCaskill a few weeks back, and he was like, we're not ready for a referendum. If I'm going to chap on the doors, if I'm not going to chap on the doors, what about currency? I don't know. What about, foreign policy? I don't know. What about nuclear weapons? I don't know, because there's nothing out there. And it doesn't seem to me that, well, if the Scottish government has been doing work on it, it's not at all apparent. Maybe it's secret. Maybe they've done a lot of stuff in secret, but I don't get that impression. And if it's secret, then people don't know what it is, so they can't have any grounding on which to vote. So I certainly agree with you that there needs to be a lot more preparation for that.
And I think it is quite easy to find out what civil servants are working on through freedom of information requests and what have you. And we know how much effort is being put into these things. Mm-hmm. So, Common Weal is doing its best. I know, and I've admired our policy papers. We try our best, but we're a really small team mm-hmm. that's funded by people like are watching this with small mm-hmm. donations. the kind of work that needs to go into preparing for independence needs a commission. It needs salaried experts who can pull all of this together for us. Mm-hmm. And, that's what I don't see happening at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I know that there's been a lot of talk about, well, we'll have the referendum and then we can pull the constitution together. Mm-hmm. But actually, people aren't going to, the people who want independence right now will still vote yes.
Yeah.
But the demographics paper that Craig at Common Weal published last week shows us quite clearly that there's this percentage of people who aren't convinced by the arguments yet, but could be persuaded. Mm-hmm. And that's why we have to do this work, to persuade those people, not the people who already want to vote yes, but to persuade the people who are a little bit unsure, bit risk averse. They want to have the answers before we have the referendum.
Yeah.
And if they don't have the answers, they'll vote no.
And do you think issues like the monarchy? I mean, I know people that are, I've met people that are like, as long as they get rid of the monarchy, I'll vote yes, kind of thing. Or, but of course, an understandable reluctance, not wanting to, rock the boat too much, not wanting to foment too much opposition, and not wanting to propose something that, possible no voters are, no, you can't take the Queen, or, how solidly do these things need to be set out? Is it, you vote for independence, we abolish the monarchy, or would that, there's always these considerations. How do you see that, of how definitive these plans need to be, or should we have?
There's a group of people in Scotland who love the Union and love the monarchy, and we'll never persuade them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think that group has decreased. I think support for the monarchy has decreased, partly because of some of the scandals.
Jeffrey Epstein, Jimmy Savile.
But also,
I'm not saying anymore.
But the Queen herself, who has always been quite popular, there was always like, well, we couldn't change it until she's gone, because she's popular. But actually, she's asking for special treatment.
Saw that.
In terms of environmental action, in terms of taxes and everything else. And I think a lot of people who know about that have said, no, enough. The monarchy is tarnished in a lot of people's eyes, partly by the various members within the royal family, partly because of the Queen's own response at the last independence referendum, where she had quite clearly said, oh, no, it's nothing to do with me, and then did clearly get involved in that.
Yeah.
I think that's probably something where after independence, we could have a citizens' assembly or something like that, but there needs to be some clarity for these uncertain voters. I don't believe that people will vote no, yes or no on the basis of the Queen.
Okay.
I think they will on the basis of currency, pensions, the things that we all care about. But most importantly, this is about the right of people in Scotland to decide what's right for Scotland. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes we get bogged down in domestic policy issues when really we should just be focusing on, who should be making decisions for Scotland.
Yeah. And how do you see independence coming about, given the current context? We have Nicola Sturgeon, who has said that, there's this mandate to have one, but you still have Boris Johnson, you still have this Section 30 business, and the likelihood of Boris Johnson sawing off Britain's arm, or getting rid of a huge amount of the resources. I mean, the vast wealth. The possibility that's pretty much zero. So, how do you see this going forward, and what do you think are alternative ways of achieving independence with some form of democratic legitimacy, of course, but not necessarily the Section 30 route? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think we have to have a referendum, and ideally it would be with the agreement to accept the result at Westminster. Mm-hmm. I think for the UDI route for Scotland is quite difficult. And at one point, I firmly believed that we should go that way. Mm-hmm. I'm not so sure now. I think that we need that the referendum type of democracy where people have participated in a process. I think the same thing about all the MPs walking out of Westminster. And I've talked to some of our MPs, and they've said, no, we were elected to do a job at Westminster. We didn't say, and if you elect me as your MP, I'll walk out. Right? So I think at least during this current Parliament, that's an important thing to recognise, that we can't just take it upon ourselves to decide for constituents, that they need to make the decision. But a lot of this is about international recognition as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I fully understand that, and the group that I was talking about earlier, the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group, we've been doing a lot of work on this. For example, I contacted the Secretariat of EFTA, and they said, if Scotland can, acquire because I was talking to him in the context of having a referendum, having a plebiscitary referendum where if the Scottish voted for a majority seats of pro-independence, that could be considered a legitimate means to achieve it. And he was like, sure, as long as Scotland has the Scottish government has the authority, the powers to sign international treaties and the powers to abide by them, the necessary powers to abide by them. They're like, fine, they've had an experience with the UK as well. I mean, Europe has seen the way the UK is. I think there's a huge amount of latent support, but many of them are of the view that Scotland has to do it for themselves. They can't do it. But if they find a peaceful and legitimate and democratic way of achieving independence, even if it's not a Section 30, I think that there would be a lot of support. But the work needs to go into it to get to contact these governments and say, here's what we're doing. We've got the situation. Would you consider supporting us? I
think the cooperation deal between the Greens and the SNP is quite interesting in that context.
Okay.
Because there's a difference between a minority government and a majority government in the way that it's seen both within the UK and abroad. And I think we maybe underestimate the amount of pressure that can be put on Westminster from Scotland. So there becomes a point where there's nothing gained by Westminster continuing to prevent a referendum. I also think that if you talk to a lot of English people, they'd be quite glad to get rid of us.
I know. Scots would stop whinging for a while, and they can just get on with their business, and England could be England, and we wouldn't have to hear about the whining Scots all the time, kind of thing.
No.
But
they still believe that they subsidise us. So if we were we are, but I think that is interesting. And Stephen just put in, call a snap election to dissolve the union. Well, I'd love to do that, but not sure that we're going to be able to. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Would you like to talk a little bit more about youth equality and the issues that concern you? Would you?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm the trustee of a children's charity. We work mainly with young children and young people with additional support needs, but also with mainstream primary schools and what have you. And we also have part of our social enterprise, which is teaching rural skills to young people, how to use a chainsaw, how to build a bonfire, all this exciting stuff. And I've seen young people and how it changes their lives when they have access to non-academic routes, where they can still build confidence and all of this kind of thing. I was recently at the National Economic Forum meeting, which was talking about the youth guarantee. And as an economic stimulus package, it actually sounds great. Let's give all of these young people a job for a year, and they can learn some skills and then go off and do something else. But that's where the rural aspect of young people comes in. If you live rurally and you're paid youth minimum wage, you can't afford to get the bus to work because travel costs are so high. And so, one of the things that I was wondering about is, and I was asking about that at National Economic Forum, is how do you support those young people who've got those additional barriers to being included in the workplace? And so my concern is that for business, they get cheap labor for a year. That's great. But actually, what's it really doing for those young people? And are we doing enough for young people that doesn't just give them a job for a while, but really allows them to develop through apprenticeships or whatever, so that they've got really needed skills and can walk into employment? We've run through the Community Jobs Scotland scheme. We've had groups of 6 young people at a time learning these outdoor skills about how to build a hedge, how to use a chainsaw, how to lay paths and things like that. We've been doing that for about 5 years. Every single one of those young people has completed the 6 months training with us and walked straight into a job. And most of them are still in the jobs that they went to from us.
Yeah.
You know, so there's a practicality about youth employment, about they need to be real jobs. They can't just be minimum wage, cheap labor. So I feel very passionate about that.
Okay. How would you evaluate the educational system in rural areas? You know, in a very general way. Is it? How would you evaluate it?
So it's a bit patchy. Right?
Okay.
In general, rural schools are very good, but with declining populations in many parts of rural Scotland, the schools are getting smaller, which means there are fewer teachers. So subject choice at secondary starts to become a real issue.
Yeah, sure.
Because if you don't have enough pupils to offer the full range of subjects, some of those young people are going to miss out. Yeah. And I know that a lot of schools go to great lengths, and online learning helps a certain bit in that with languages or whatever. But, you know, because the schools tend to be smaller, there is a lack of subject choice in some of the schools, which I think is probably the biggest difference. I think that you can't generalize about rural schools because some of them do very well and some of them are needing further help. And the shortage of teachers, rural probably has a bit of an advantage because a lot of people, if they're young people bringing up their own young families, quite like the idea of living in rural. The problem is that a lot of the housing has been sold and is now second homes or retirement homes and this kind of thing. So we have a real housing crisis in rural areas, and that actually prevents people working in a whole variety of areas. I know a hotel in Galloway that had been looking for a head cook, a head chef at a very good salary for more than a year, but couldn't get anybody because that person couldn't find anywhere to bring his family that they could live locally. Yeah. And that, you know, that's a dreadful situation. And, you know, we've got GPs who would love to work in rural GP practices, but their spouses can't get, or their partners can't get work locally. So there's a bit of a balancing act going on, and I'm not saying it's all perfect yet.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let's go ahead and go over some of the questions. Surely, from Stephen, surely we have be monarchy free and not letting foreign landowners steal and abuse our land and wildlife. That's a view. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I would say that, you know, we talk about the historic landed estates, the Buccleuchs and Queensbury and Hopetoun and all of these, but actually a lot of our land is owned by foreigners who have bought up big swathes. There's a couple who are doing it, they say, you know, they're going to help the environment and work with the community. But there's some of them who are just fencing off the land, trying to prevent access, and it's not helpful. So, you know, I would definitely prefer we didn't have that ownership model. That makes sense.
And how would you change it? What would you do? Put in a constitution or put in law that, or I think would be better to have something in a constitution that's like not changeable by law or is much more difficult to change. But what kind of provisions would you think that would be appropriate to put in a constitution to balance out the land ownership and allow for, normal people to afford it and not have it all sold off to sheiks and investor capitalists, venture capitalists?
It's an interesting thought. I'm not sure a constitution should be about land ownership. I think we have other tools that we could use.
Okay.
So we've got sort of land tax value is really important on that. Mm-hmm. A lot of these people, if they were being taxed on an exponential rate of how much land they own, and their tax increased according to the size of their holdings, I think we'd see a lot of them trying to sell bits off, and that would actually help break up the big estates. Mm-hmm. But we've also got, zoning laws. There are all kinds of planning things that we could actually use much better than we do. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure about it being in the Constitution per se.
Well, I think the way I see it is the Constitution should have basic fundamental principles that can be applied through law. So certainly things change over time. But for example, one that I put in my draft that I made up is that all land must be registered and taxed in Scotland, and that anything that isn't could revert to could become public ownership. So basically, if the landowners want to hang on to the land, then they need to register it and be taxed in Scotland. And how that's done is a matter of law. But I think it's important to kind of get these fundamental principles in there, so that the law is guided in a proper way. This
is a manifesto commitment. I would like to see a political party standing with that in their manifesto. Yeah. Because that is important. And we do in the S1.EP manifesto have a strong commitment towards land reform, but I think we need to push it along a little bit. But for me, it's very clear that land reform is absolutely essential for both the kind of equality that we want amongst people in an independent Scotland. But it's also about redressing some of the things that have happened in the past.
Sure. It always is. It always is.
Never been addressed. So, when are we going to have that reconciliation of the people who were chucked off their land? Yeah.
Another one. It's real viper's nest, as we say in France. But sectarianism. Is it possible to how can that be addressed? Because I spent time in Scotland in the early '90s and had a girlfriend on the east end of Glasgow, and I was just baffled by the sectarianism. It's like, wait, you hate them, and I get it from a certain level, but they were all such lovely people. Why can't you get along? Kind of thing. I know it's a kind of overly simplistic question, but you wonder if maybe that's something else that could be addressed on independence.
I think it needs to be addressed right now. And I'm absolutely shocked by the way that Orange Order has been allowed to march and has basically been doing hateful things that, were it any other group, would have been challenged in the courts by now. That people would have been arrested. And I don't understand why sectarianism is the allowed racism. We're so careful about races and hate crimes and all of this kind of thing, and yet somehow when it's sectarianism, it's okay. It's not okay in my book.
Maybe it's just too much of a hot potato, because
maybe it's a cultural thing within our state or institutions, which I think is more likely, and I think that needs there needs to be an investigation, and it needs to be rooted out.
Yeah, I think that's something that Citizens Commission could play an important role in. Citizens Assembly, bringing them together, maybe being able to talk through a lot of the stuff, and because I think like a lot of stuff that especially, I mean, it's more magnified in Northern Ireland, but you go back, well, they killed my dad, and then he killed, I mean, they go back so far with the tit for tat violence, but there just doesn't seem to be a recognition. Well, you did it too. It's not, it's kind of
but this is taught to babies and very young children. They learn it then, and so the whole cultural issues are incredibly difficult to change once people have grown up through that. So I honestly think that it's something that we need to be addressing now, and it's not good enough to say, well, we'll sort that after independence.
No, I agree with that. Yeah. So, okay. All right. Let me see any other questions. Well, about land ownership, the monarchy. Let's see. When will the secret poll on Scottish independence commissioned by the Tories using COVID money be published? Michael Gove was told by the courts that it must be published a few weeks ago. I don't think you can answer that any more than I can, but it speaks to...
I wasn't in a nightclub and didn't get to ask him, because if I'd been up in Aberdeen, maybe we could have had a wee dance and asked him for the answer to that question. I don't know. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I don't know how many people will have done YouGov polling, because, of course, that's owned by a Tory donor. And it's been quite interesting just to see what polls they're asking. What are the questions?
Yeah, that's yeah. No.
So I always keep an eye on, so what are they actually asking about? Because that sort of tells you the thinking inside the party of what they need to know. Yeah. How safe are they, kind of thing.
Yeah, but I think that they're using these polls as a justification. Oh, well, the support's only at this or it's only at that, and as you say, these polling companies are owned by Tories and others, and of course they don't have an interest in showing a necessarily an accurate result with the proper questions asked. So. They talk about how popular the monarchy is, and okay, yeah, maybe the Queen is popular, whatever that means, but at the same time, you could ask, if it was asked, do you feel that it's legitimate to have a hereditary monarchy in what we would hope would be a modern democracy? And so if it was asked that way, I'm sure you'd get a big different answer than they say, oh, do you like the Queen, or whatever. So apparently we are part of a voluntary union. Can't we just walk away? And that's what I was getting at with the research that we're doing into whether or not could the Scottish MPs simply withdraw from the Treaty of Union.
I think it's an interesting part. I mean, different scholars have different views on this.
Of course.
So some people say, it was a voluntary union. Some people would say it was actually an enforced union by the monarchy and the people that made money off it at the time. And that's not a question for me to answer. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I know some, though, and I also know how confused some of them are over the whole thing.
I think, and it's just par for the course with this unwritten constitution that has just piles of statute and statutory instruments and prerogative powers, all that, and it's just that's certainly something that needs to be resolved with a coherent, clear constitution. What should be our relationship with the EU as part of an independence campaign? Or should we leave that decision until after independence? I'll start on that, and you can intervene after. I think that Scotland can and should join EFTA immediately, because they can get in. Scotland can get in easily, as long as it's a considered legitimate and democratic and peaceful way of achieving independence, and as long as Scotland has the powers to, as I said, negotiate treaties and the powers to abide by them, Scotland will be welcome. And then you can leave the EU for later. EU membership is going to be contentious. I mean, Spain, they may not veto it, but they're not going to make life easy for Scotland. And EFTA would be, and there's several countries that were part of EFTA and then became part of the EU. I think Portugal and Sweden were among them. So, I mean, that's my view, is that, EFTA first, once independence is achieved, and then see about the EU later, but that's my view. How do you see it?
So I think it's really interesting that, again, going back to this demographics paper, voting intention paper that Common Weal just put out, there was a significant number of people who've moved from yes to no because of Brexit, because they actually were quite pro-Brexit and leaving the EU. So I think it would be very foolish of us to say that we're going to take a particular stance prior to doing the work needed for a referendum. I think that one of the problems is that we know that we voted 62% in Scotland to stay in the EU. Whether that's still the proportion or whether it's actually increased, we don't actually know. And this is where it would be really helpful to have good polling, Scottish polling, as opposed to being a subset of the UK. Unfortunately, polling is really rather expensive, especially when you want to dig down into into subgroups. But I think that if we take a stance and say, yes, we want to join the EU after independence, that will lose us those voters who were yes last time, but actually quite like Brexit. But they might have changed their mind. We don't know. So we need to make it based on a referendum, but also cover off the fact that might, again, put some previous yes voters off if they think that the two things are automatically linked.
Okay. What is your view on my proposal of joining EFTA first, and then after independence, democratically seeing later, if full EU membership is a good option?
It depends on what your reason for joining one or the other is. If you just want access to the single market, joining EFTA works quite well. My husband's Swiss, that's why I've got a weird name, by the way.
Okay.
So I understand it from that perspective. But do you want
and Switzerland's a member of EFTA as well.
So, but do you want to be governed by rules that you don't sit at the table to decide on?
Yeah,
so that's really the difference between the two.
Well, there is debate about that, because in the treaties, in the treaties between EFTA and the EU, which govern their relationship, any issue which impinges on the shared powers, the EU does have to negotiate with EFTA about it. It's not like EFTA is completely apart from that. There are, again, provisions I believe in the treaties between EFTA and the EU.
Set the rules. If you're a part of EFTA, you're not part of the group that set the rules. You maybe have to do a bit of consultation and a bit of tweaking, but that's really the thing. Do we just want access to the single market? And there's a reasonable case to say, actually, yeah, that's enough. That helps with exports and what have you. And
just to add that, and Scotland would be free as a member of EFTA. They would be free to participate in any of the European programs that they want to, including Erasmus, the research program. So there is that as well. It's not just the single market. There are additional benefits as well. And for what I was talking to with the person from EFTA, he was kind of, I think that there's a consensus, as I understand it, among the members that they like their sovereignty. They like to not have to, maybe there are rules that they have to abide by, but otherwise there are things that they can do that the other EU members can't. My main point was being EFTA can be done in weeks or months rather than years. It would get Scotland back into the single market quickly, and then I've noticed Jim saying EFTA yes, fully EU no. That's certainly what the Swiss have decided. And they have a referendum on it every couple of years. The difference when they have a referendum in Switzerland is that the totally unbiased civil service prepares a leaflet with both the pros and the cons of each side laid out, so people are able to make a much more informed vote. And that's what I would say ought to happen here. We need an information campaign to make sure that people really understand
And I'm not talking about the people on this call, because I'm sure most of you do understand,
Yeah.
but it's the people who aren't engaged in these conversations. How are they going to vote? And we need to make sure that they understand what the difference is.
Okay. And what are your views on things like, for example, currency? Should Scotland set up their own currency? And I know the Common Weal has done lots and lots of work on that. So I'm assuming you're in agreement with that.
Absolutely. We must have our own currency, even more importantly now than before. But it's obvious that we are not going to share a currency with the rest of the UK. But it's also really essential that we have our own central bank and all of the powers and possibilities that come from that. Yeah. And that's how we actually build a prosperous Scotland going forward. We need the National Bank, and we need to do all of those things, because we need to have a vision for Scotland that possibly isn't about growth and GDP. Yeah. It's about well-being and the kind of lives that we all live. So for me, it's not about, we need to have these policies and this support and blah, blah. We need to remove poverty. Yeah. And, not chopped up into little bits of, oh, this is young people's poverty or children's poverty or old age pensioners' poverty. There is no reason why a country as rich as Scotland should have the levels of poverty that we have. And to be able to manage that, we need our own central bank. We need our own currency. Okay.
All right. We're getting near to the end. So is there anything else you'd like to say, or kind of things you'd like to speak about before we let our viewers go?
I just thought I've noticed Stephen's question about a referendum date, whether or not it's going to be called at the next S&P conference next weekend. Stephen, I will be there, and I would love to see that. I'm not holding my breath.
Okay. All right. And as I understood, I was speaking to one of your colleagues on the NEC, and he was mentioning that they were pushing in the manifesto for there kind of to be metrics of what it means for the COVID thing to be over, so that then the referendum would be called. Do you know if that's
going to be part of it? Discussed at conference, because there'll be motions put forward and a discussion with the membership about it. So ask me back on in a couple of weeks and we'll be able to talk about it.
Okay, great. Okay. All right. Let me just see if there's any other believe in Scotland and directly funding Scottish polls. So there is some of that. Do you think social media adds to sectarian attitudes? Any views on that?
Social media adds to bubbles. And sectarianism.
Well, I like that. I'll use it. Hope you don't have a patent on it.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, it does, because it allows people to talk to people who've got the same views as they have, and we see it in all aspects, whether it's about COVID, whether it's about left-wing politics, or whatever it is. Yes, of course, social media encourages you to listen to people that think the same thing as you do.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely agree. The pursuit of eternal growth is insanity and fuels poverty. I agree with that. Growing up in the United States, oh, the stock market's soaring. Oh, GDP is all that. And, people will.
How does that help you?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, most people are,
Most of us don't have big stock portfolios.
Exactly.
But are funding the elite. So let's stop funding the elite. Let's fund normal people instead.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Well, unless you have anything else you want to add, it's been delightful having you. And would you like to say anything else before we go?
No, I just want to say it's an absolute pleasure. And I think maybe just to say, this striving for indie is hard. Sometimes it makes us a bit down, because we think we've been trying so hard and we don't seem to be much further forward. And it's easy to become a bit despondent, but we are a really strong movement, and we've got a really strong country, and it will happen. We just need to get out there and campaign. I don't believe that we should sit and wait for government to make the decisions. As people, as citizens of Scotland, we're the ones who need to be pushing this forward. And I know that Believe in Scotland and other parts of the indie movement are really working hard on it. And so I just beg you all to stick with it. Don't give up. The prize is massive. So let's stand in there.
Okay. On that positive note, thank you very much. And I'll be delighted to have you back again soon.
Perfect. I'll look forward to it.
Okay, great. Good night, everybody.
Bye, everyone.